Okay, so there's a story about an incident that happened at Disney back in the 1950s. Yeah, I know. I'm not here to tell you ancient stories from the golden age of animation. I get that. Believe me, I get that. I know exactly why I'm sitting in this chair with you three gentlemen looming over me. Just indulge me for a moment. I promise there's a point to this. So, back in the 50s, Disney wasn't the entertainment juggernaut they are today. At that point, they were almost exclusively concerned with churning out cartoons. Most people today are under the impression that all the company's films were successful, but the truth of the matter is that Disney was in a lot of trouble back then. A number of their films had failed financially, even some of the ones that are seen today as classics, and it was really the television and newspaper cartoons that were keeping the lights on. Small film strips, too, the kind that used to play before the feature presentations. A couple of cartoonists were working on a short when they realized that they needed a particular sound effect to really make a scene work. It wasn't one they'd used before, so they didn't have it on file. And after going through the sound archives, they couldn't find anything that was quite right. Um, Somehow, one of them realized that they could get what they wanted by slowing down the noise of a soldering iron. They tinkered around with it for a while, and at one point, they put it down all the way to 12 hertz. See, they didn't understand what sound can do if you're not careful. The cartoonists were sick for days after they created the effect. Rumor has it that Walt Disney happened to be there with them at the time and that he fell ill as well. Having a 12 hertz sound run through your body is roughly the equivalent of sitting in an office chair and letting your coworker spin you around for a few hours, then trying to stand up and walk around. When the body is exposed to sound, just like when it's exposed to pretty much anything else, there's always a reaction. This is especially true with low frequencies. We call that infrasounds. Our ears can't hear them, but they can do a number on us. Did you know that the noise around 19 hertz can cause people to hallucinate? That's because it's the resonant frequency for the human eye. The vibrations can cause us to see all kinds of crazy things. The real dangerous one, though, that's 7 hertz. It's the resonant frequency for your brain and your other internal organs. You crank that one up if you really want to get the party started. Everything from nausea, disorientation. You start to get paranoid, like everyone in the world is watching you. You let it go on long enough, and your organs actually physically start to tear themselves apart. Any longer than that, and that's it. The end. You're done. The reason I'm telling you all this is because you need to understand that the science behind what Dr. Varadkar attempted was sound. No pun intended. As much as it sounds like something that came out of a bad pulp science fiction novel, it's actually based on 100 years of scientific research. That's how he got the government to agree to the funding. I wasn't a part of that pitch meeting, so I can only imagine that those suits were sitting there licking their chops at what he was presenting them. And it makes sense, too, right? If sound can be used to affect the human body, it should be possible to use sound to make changes to it as well. With the right frequency, volume, and other conditions, it would be theoretically possible to make a person far more susceptible to suggestion. Taking it a step further, it would even be possible to basically rewrite how that person thinks. The human body is, for all intents and purposes, a biological machine, and sound can be used to hack that machine. Now, you know what happened next. The committee approved Dr. Varadkar's grant. How could they not? He was telling that he was going to give them a way to directly influence each and every member of the population on a silver platter, even if they weren't going to use that technology in American citizens. And let's just be honest with ourselves and acknowledge that someone eventually would have tried to do just that. It would have made one hell of a weapon. Win a war without firing a single shot by making your enemies see things your way, whether they want to or not. The committee went one step further, though. Broadcar needed test subjects, lots of them, and they needed to be highly varied. Different backgrounds, different biological makeups, different diets, all of that. Being able to adjust the thought process of a single person wouldn't cut it. He needed to make sure that he found universal sounds and frequencies so that anyone and everyone would be affected. Because of this, the committee agreed to allow Rodcar to use an entire town as his own personal playground. And I gotta tell you, even with everything that's happened, that's the part I still cannot get my head wrapped around. The United States government turned over an entire town of its own citizens to a single person so that he could poke and prod and experiment on it. I guess that pretty much sums up what our own elected officials really think about us, doesn't it? The town that Rodcar chose is Williams, Arizona. It was the perfect place for his experiments, really. It had a varied enough population that it presented a wide range of test subjects, but it was also isolated from the main highways, and it had very little in the way of outsiders passing through. It was 3,108 brains to pump dangerous sounds into. 3,108 men, women, and children that didn't have a choice. Vrodkar told me that he was working on a new warning system that could transmit a signal throughout a large area by using particular tones on specific frequencies. That's not anything that's needed here in the States, but it would be invaluable in places where groups of people live that don't have the luxury of readily available cell phone service. People could be warned about imminent floods in even the most remote parts of the Middle East, for example. A specific sound would be transmitted over a much larger distance than, say, the sirens we use now to warn people about tornadoes. It would completely eliminate issues like language barriers. A person hears this particular sound, and they know that they need to get to somewhere safe. Rodkar said that what he was working on was a series of tones that could be used as a sort of universal system. One tone for flood, another one for sandstorm, a different one for tornado, so on and so forth. He told me that once he figured the system out, he was going to work with frequencies to increase distance and reception by the human body. I know it sounds crazy now, but I actually did believe that I was helping with some kind of humanitarian project. Part of the project was conceal the towers from view. I did find that part odd, but the way it was explained to me was that it was simply to not take away from the natural beauty around the town, and also not to call unneeded attention to the project. Yeah, I know it was a bad reason, and I should have questioned it further, but it really wasn't that strange of a request. I've been contracted by countless people that want a system that works, but don't want to see it when it's doing so. It's not like I'm not accustomed to hiding some rich person's giant satellite dish or transmitting towers in a football stadium. Rodkar and we got along well enough during the building stage. Once the towers were finished, he asked me to stay on site in case any mechanical issues came up. Uh, I have a pretty busy schedule, and my services are in pretty high demand. So at first I turned him down. Um, then he turned around and showed me the figure he was willing to pay me for a few months extra work, and I decided I couldn't afford to turn that down. Now, this next part is what Vrodkar himself ended up telling me about what happened. I didn't find out about what he had really been up to until later, and as much as I like to say that I had a bad feeling or some sneaking suspicion that something was up, the truth is I didn't notice anything that made me question what I'd been told. So what I'm about to tell you is what he told me, not what I witnessed firsthand. So take that for what it's worth. Rodkar and his team started small. They already had a number of frequencies that would make a person feel anxious or disoriented, so they tried to see if they could simply tweak those to make the test subjects more open to suggestion. Nothing really happened for the first few weeks. That may sound like a long time to be working on such a small range of sounds, but you have to understand just how precise of frequencies they were working with. There's a lot of room between 8 and 9 hertz, for example. Vrodkar was testing frequencies out to over 50 decimal places. The majority of the time, the residents didn't even realize anything was happening. We can't hear anything below roughly 20 hertz, and he was working in ranges much lower than that. He was also just using short bursts in the beginning. It wasn't until he started to extend the broadcast times that things really began to go downhill. The number of people going to the local hospital rose dramatically. A lot of the people were complaining about feeling sick even though they didn't have the usual symptoms of a cold or the flu. There were several cases involving coughing up blood or bleeding from various orifices. A few elderly patients suffered heart attacks. Rodkar was aware of all this, Somehow he was getting all of the medical records that were processed at the hospital. Either someone was getting the information to him or he was obtaining it himself. I'm not sure which it is. Like I said, this is just what I pieced together from what he told me and from things I saw later. I didn't see Varadkar much during that time period. Since the towers were working without issues, there wasn't much for me to do, so I spent the majority of my time in the trailer that I'd been provided with. Like the other trailers and the few buildings that had been constructed, it was heavily soundproofed. I and all of the other staff on site would be sent a text message when a test was about to occur, and we'd go into our designated areas to wait for it to be over. I don't know what test number it was when things started to get out of hand. If I had to take a guess, I'd say it probably wasn't a single test, but more a cumulative effect from multiple ones being done. Uh, all I know for sure is that dozens of assaults were reported to the local police within a 3-hour window. We were located quite a few miles outside of the city limits, but I could still hear gunshots when I stood outside of my trailer. I was listening to that distinctive popping sound when one of the guards came into camp with the news that a fire was burning on the east side of the town. Rodker and his team came rushing out of the temporary metal building they used as their base camp. I've never seen anyone move as quickly as they were. He barked a few orders to his team, and they piled into a group of minivans and left immediately. Once they were gone, he yelled at the guards to begin breaking down the camp. He then came rushing over to me and grabbed me by the shirt, demanding that I tell him how to turn off the towers. I was completely baffled by his shouting. I knew for a fact that he was aware how to shut them down. He had been doing just that at the end of each test. I tried to explain that to him, but he kept saying that they were still on and that I needed to turn them off. His eyes were wild, and there was this spittle or foam at the corners of his mouth. He was usually the most calm and collected man I had ever known, but at that moment, he looked like a maniac, an absolute lunatic. He brought me into the metal building and once again instructed me to shut off the broadcast towers. As calmly as I could, I told him that it was all done through the main power switch, which was on the main computer board underneath a series of a dozen monitors. He sneered at me and pointed at the monitors, telling me that they couldn't possibly be off if this was what was still happening in Williams. I didn't know what he was talking about, so I went over to the monitors to take a look. I immediately regretted that decision, and I have every minute since. The images on those monitors, they showed what I imagine hell to look like. Citizens of the town were tearing themselves and each other apart. The atrocities on those monitors being committed, it it wasn't a riot. I know that's the popular story, but I'm here to tell you that it most definitely wasn't a riot. As strange as this is going to sound, it wasn't organized enough to be one. It was like everyone had suddenly decided that it was every man for himself. I I watched as an older man of maybe 60, just brutally clubbed in the skull of a teenage boy with, I think it was a tire iron. I actually knew that man. I had gone to town several times to get food or just to stretch my legs when testing wasn't happening. So I recognized him as the owner of a local deli. He was a nice man. It I couldn't tell who the boy was. He he just there wasn't enough of him left to even call him a person anymore, let alone make an identification. On another monitor, two women were slowly driving around the parking lot of a gas station in an old beat-up station wagon. A rope was tied around the back bumper, and at the end of the rope was a man with his neck tied in a noose. He was screaming as he was dragged across the pavement, leaving these smears of blood and a trail behind him. There were countless examples of depravity on those displays, but there's one that I cannot get it out of my head no matter how hard I try. There was a woman standing directly in front of one of the cameras. I'm sure the camera was hidden, but just by some stroke of luck, she had managed to get into the very center of the frame. She was just standing there in jeans and a hooded sweatshirt, and she was reaching up and slowly peeling chunks of skin off of her face with this almost bored expression. I tore my eyes away from the monitor as Varadkar once again demanded that I shut off the towers. My stomach was churning as I looked down at the computer board on the desk. I thought I was going to throw up right then and there, but somehow I managed to keep myself together. The light at the indicator when the towers were transmitting, it was off. I checked the logs and verified that there wasn't even any power running to the towers. They weren't sending out a signal, and they hadn't been for several hours. When I showed all that to Varadkar, he sat down in one of the leather chairs and buried his face in his hands. He looked exhausted, and he seemed older. I was close to panic at this point. I knew that what was happening in Williams had to be at least partially my fault, and I yelled at him to tell me just what the fuck was going on. All he did was he pointed at a clipboard sitting on one of the tables. I picked it up and I started to read through the documents. As I was doing that, Varadkar very slowly, very haltingly told me what I told you earlier. The real intentions of the project, the committee meeting, and how the government had handed over an entire town to him. He didn't sound remorseful. If anything, it was more like he was trying to convince me that he had done the right thing and this was just some sort of acceptable outcome. The papers were a listing of test numbers along with the results of those tests. There weren't any exact frequencies listed, but there were reference numbers that I assumed could be used to find that out. The most recent test, the one that happened a few hours prior, it was detailed at the top of the sheet. At first, the team had thought that it was another failed test. Nothing had happened immediately, and the people that they were observing didn't seem to be affected by it in any way. About an hour after the test, though, a man was observed hitting another man without any provocation. More of these incidents happened as time passed until suddenly the entire town had just erupted in violence. Instead of things growing calmer the further out they got from the test, they had instead inexplicably began to ramp up. There was this handwritten note at the bottom of the page that I had to read several times to make sure that I was understanding it correctly. One of the scientists had found out that the test frequency was still resonating in the brains of the subjects they had monitors installed in. I have no idea how they got monitors into people's brains. I mean, there's no way that the people knew about that, right? They never would have volunteered for that, and Varadkar's group wouldn't have told them what it was for anyway, so they would have been blindly accepting something. I can't imagine that's the case. Regardless of how they did it, the scientists noted that the resonance was actually growing stronger as time passed rather than fading. You have to understand, that simply should not have been possible. That's not how it works. If you take away the source, there's nothing to continue to cause the resonance to happen. There could be effects from the resonance, yeah, but it wouldn't just continue on. And for it to keep growing stronger, I don't have any explanation for it. There was more to it, though. The vibration was actually passing on from person to person. When an affected person was close enough to an unaffected one for a long enough period of time, the brain of the unaffected one would begin to display a synchronous vibration. It was the equivalent of striking a tuning fork, putting next to a second one, and the second one just starting to vibrate at the same frequency. To put it in even simpler terms, this madness was contagious. I put down the clipboard and I just stared at Vodkar for a long time. I don't know how long it was. I couldn't think of a single thing to say. I mean, how do you put the feelings you experience from reading something like that into words? Vodkar was the one who actually ended up speaking first. He raised his head out of his hands and looked directly at me. The expression on his face was, if I had to describe it, I'd say it was the expression of someone that had completely given up. The devil's tone, he said, in a matter-of-fact voice that sent a chill down my spine. Before I knew what was happening, he reached under his lab coat and he pulled a gun out from his belt. I hadn't noticed it before with everything else that was happening. He turned it on me, pointed directly at me, and I stood completely still. I was afraid that even the smallest movement might set him off. But then, without even blinking, he turned the gun, put it right into his mouth, and pulled the trigger. It went off with this loud roar, and his body slumped forward in the chair as pieces of skin and blood and bone splattered onto the wall behind him. And that's when the guards came into the building. You obviously know the rest. I had a hood put over my head, and the next time it came off was when I got here, wherever here is. Look, I don't know what you're going to do to me, and frankly, I really don't care. I didn't know what I was a part of, but it doesn't change the fact I was still part of it. But it doesn't matter now, though. The only thing that matters is that you figure out how to stop that resonance. There is no way that it's Justin Williams at this point. There were hours between the final test and that outbreak of violence. How many people left town during that time period without knowing what they were carrying inside of them? It's impossible to know. You have to figure out how to stop it before it keeps getting passed on and on and on until we are all completely and totally fucked. Do you understand me? You have to stop it now, and when you do, you need to toss everything Vodkar worked on into a fire and fucking burn it to ashes. Slam this door to hell closed and make sure it never opens again.